There is a group in Europe that seems fundamentally unable to coexist with greater society. The members of this group are disproportionately violent, as indicated by crime statistics. Most cases of vandalism can also be chalked up to them, and if there is any violent crime committed in your area and the members of this group live there, you can be certain it was them. It's time to break the silence. We need to talk openly about this group and their degenerate behavior. Namely, men. Now look, I know what you're thinking. Adam, I know and like plenty of men in my life, and they aren't all violent savages. The actions of some bad men shouldn't be used to condemn the entire group. To which I say, why don't you try living around them for a bit before making your cocked men's rights activist arguments? See how you'll like them after they stab you in the throat for a cigarette, or rob your house, or beat you up for looking at them wrong. Sometimes, men even band together into large, violent groups to wreak havoc and burn down cities. Sometimes due to the most innocuous things, like their favorite football team losing a match or something. Of course, to be fair, some women also commit violent crime, and some of them also damage public property, but just look at the prison population. 9 out of 10 violent crime inmates are men. Now, I'm not sexist. I myself have male friends. I'm only interested in making our communities safer, and the logical solution to that is to get rid of the group that's responsible for all the violence. Therefore, I advocate for rounding up all the men, putting them in specific residential areas within a city, preferably around the edge somewhere, and then building a wall to segregate them from the rest of us to keep our city safe from their criminal, violent nature. Right. So the solutions you've just listened to, despite being absolutely preposterous, would be an extremely effective tool at curtailing violent crime. However, we never hear it from the crowd most obsessed with law and order. Men as a group never seem to come up despite being disproportionately violent. In the US, the discussion always goes back to black people, and in Europe, to Roma people. Discrimination against Roma and the ensuing socio-economic problems have been a constant theme in Central and Eastern Europe for centuries at this point, and it really bothers me that many of my fellow Europeans who claim to be anti-racist and progressive suddenly turn into an SS officer when discussing Roma. And the situation of the Roma within Europe really is dire. Casual racism and sometimes openly genocidal rhetoric towards them are fully accepted in many places, including within the European Union in the year of our Lord 2023. Meanwhile, entire generations suffer and get stuck at the rock bottom of society in a vicious cycle where social problems cause hatred and disdain, which causes more social problems, which causes even more hatred, and so on. And just to head off a criticism, because I know it's coming, am I some sheltered inner-city liberal cuck who has only seen pictures of Roma from afar during his white guilt classes and who is now here to lecture the silent majority suffering from violent Roma crime about how evil and racist they are and how Roma are misunderstood angels? No. I grew up in Hungary, having lived a quarter of a century there. Throughout that entire time, I had Roma schoolmates, friends and acquaintances, and lived in a neighborhood that had Roma inhabitants. I then moved to the Czech Republic, where I had Roma neighbors, and lived in Ústí nad Labem for a while, where most of the Czech Roma minority is concentrated. There I also lived around Roma, encountering them on a daily basis. So if someone wants to make the try living around Roma first and you'll see our point argument, that's not going to work on me, sorry. So first off, who are the Roma? They are a nomadic people who migrated to medieval Europe from Rajasthan, India through the Byzantine Empire. Perhaps due to their Hindu cultural background, Byzantines branded them as heretics or atsigáni, a word which should sound familiar to my Eastern European viewers. As Roma moved into Europe, their reception was mixed. Countries in Eastern Europe were generally tolerant of them as long as they paid taxes. In Western Europe, though, their treatment ranged from banishment to open genocide. In England, they got hanged. In France, they got branded and their heads shaven. In Bohemia, the right ear of Roma women was cut off. In Moravia, their left ear. In Holland, they were legally slaughtered during so-called heidenjachten or heathen hunts. There was the Great Gypsy Roundup in 1749 Spain that saw thousands arrested and hundreds dying in prison, but Eastern Europe wasn't a haven of equality either. In Romania, there was a particularly gruesome Roma slave market up until the 19th century. As you can see, historically, it hasn't been particularly fun to be Roma in Europe. Later on, with the dawn of the Enlightenment, Roma were subjected to things like forced assimilation, prohibiting the use of Romani languages under threat of violence, banning marriage between Roma, forcefully taking Roma children from their parents and giving them to non-Roma families, and so on. And of course, when the Nazis came to power, Roma were the first to suffer. 500,000 were murdered, but after World War II, Roma Holocaust survivors were denied any reparations. Even in the supposedly egalitarian and leftist, huge air quotes there, Soviet sphere of influence, they were ignored at best. Otherwise, they were often segregated, sometimes physically walled up from the rest of society, or worse. In Soviet Czechoslovakia, for example, there were forced sterilizations, deportations, destructions of communities, and so on. A particularly Another example is the Czech town I lived in, Ústí nad Labem. It has a large Roma community, many of them having Hungarian surnames, I found. Turns out they are the descendants of Hungarian-speaking Roma from the south of Slovakia, forcibly deported by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party to the north of Czechia as cheap labor for the growing heavy industry. They worked the lowest jobs, received no training or education, and were moved into dilapidated, abandoned housing left behind by the deported Sudeten Germans after World War II. So you had a group of people, mostly segregated from society, in subpar housing, doing the lowest jobs with no further training or education provided to them. Their livelihoods solely depending on unskilled labor in the local heavy industry. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, taking the heavy industry with it. Oops. The result? Enormous rates of poverty among Roma, bringing with it a slew of socio-economic problems which led to frictions within society, which led to more discrimination and hatred, which led to more socio-economic problems, and the vicious cycle is complete. A particularly vivid example of this is the following. In the city there was a dilapidated residential block where Roma lived, famous for its social problems. After many complaints, local authorities finally got to work to solve the issue by building a wall around them. In the year 1999, there was a big local protest over it. The whole affair turned into a minor international scandal even, dubbing it the European Wall of Shame. In the end, the wall came down and the residential units were vacated. The blocks stand there to this day, abandoned. Now then, about segregation. Let's consider that segregating men example from the beginning. I think we can all agree that segregating older men is a bad idea. But some of you might then say, men are more violent than women, sure, but Roma men are especially more violent. And since males are necessary for the continuation of the species, it's easier if we segregate based on ethnicity instead of sex, i.e. the Roma are put into the walled-off ghetto at the edge of town, and voila, the city is safer now. This is a very common argument in Eastern Europe. But if you think about it for more than a minute from a purely utilitarian perspective, it doesn't really makes sense. If we're looking to decrease crime, especially violent crime, then ethnicity is not a good metric to go by. In Eastern European countries where most Roma live, there are plenty of non-Roma criminals too, and the common denominator between Roma and non-Roma criminals is poverty. If you are poor and uneducated, statistically speaking, you'll be far more likely to commit crime, especially violent crime. So if our goal is to decrease crime, we should be talking about segregating poor people, not Roma people. But just like male segregation, the topic of poor segregation is also not discussed. The conversation always goes back to Roma in Europe and black people in America. So the facts are clear. Poor, uneducated people commit more crimes. The majority of Roma are poor and uneducated. But there are also millions of poor, uneducated non-Roma. I mean, it's Eastern Europe, are you kidding? So if we want to have less crime, we should group people based on wealth and education. So segregating poor, uneducated people. Anyone at or below the poverty line and without a high school diploma goes into the ghetto, neatly walled up from the rest of us. And voila, the city is much safer now with all the poors gone. And we can also agree that only an absolute monster would suggest something like that. A deranged sociopath, cruel, ice-cold and unfeeling, who would condemn millions to a life of perpetual misery in the ghetto in exchange for their own perceived safety and comfort. But segregating the problem away also doesn't work. You're not solving the underlying social problems, you're just putting the problem behind a wall and then doing your best to forget about it. It's the equivalent of coming home, noticing that your bedroom is on fire, so you close the bedroom door and stop using that part of your home. And we all see why that would be a subpar solution. So segregation, besides not solving the underlying problem, would be a monstrous act as we've agreed. And I sure hope segregation doesn't suddenly become okay when it comes to Roma people. Well, stay tuned. As monstrous as it is, segregating based on wealth is actually more defensible than segregating based on ethnicity, since being poor is something you can theoretically change about yourself, unlike your ethnicity. Therefore, logically, if segregating poor people is viewed as a monstrous act, then segregating Roma people should be perceived as outright diabolical. Right? Right? But it's not. Fucking over Roma is socially accepted, sometimes even expected throughout Eastern Europe, usually with the full support of the state, by the way. Okay, but then how come Roma can't just get their own shit together and prove to society that they can indeed integrate? Why don't Roma just escape their poverty in this meritocratic free market? To answer this question, I've talked to Boglárka Fedorko, the director of Roma Versitas, a Hungarian organization dedicated to helping Roma students overcome the effects of systemic racism and help them achieve an education.
There is a lot of disadvantages, not because Roma are culturally inferior and don't want to learn and are incapable of learning, which a lot of politicians and the majority society would like us to believe, but because in European societies, Roma live in deep poverty in the most cases. So according to the latest research, 80% of the Roma population in Europe lives below the poverty line. So poverty, makes it very difficult to obtain quality education and participate successfully in education. Because if you don't have a table to write your homework on, That's again a big obstacle. If your parents are unable to help you with your homework, that's a huge obstacle. So already in the primary school, those Roma kids who are coming from poverty, they acquire a lot of disadvantages. And even though there are some who are not coming from deep poverty, they also face racism. So that is starting very early on in the Hungarian education system, and this viewing the Roma as other, the non-deserving, this also manifests in the practice of segregation.
On top of all this, some Eastern European governments are actively involved in discriminating against Roma. I've made a community post about a recent occasion where thousands of Ukrainian Roma arrived at Prague main station fleeing the war. They did not get any aid or services for refugees as the Czech government insisted that they all have Hungarian citizenships. They were Hungarian speaking, you see. As Ukrainian-Hungarian dual citizens, they wouldn't be eligible for refugee status and should be sent back to Hungary by train instead, which Hungary refused, however. Hundreds of Roma were milling around the station and thousands in the city for weeks until Czech public television revealed that the authorities already vetted 5,500 of them and that only 150 of them had Hungarian passports. And the Czech government kept this information secret for weeks, hoping that Hungary would cave under diplomatic pressure in the meantime so they can get rid of those refugees instead of helping them because they are Roma. Moreover, in the Czech Republic's second largest city, Brno, the authorities straight up stated that they won't be helping Roma refugees from Ukraine because they lie, cheat, steal and abuse the system. None of this was substantiated by any evidence, by the way. I guess the Brno city leadership just had a feeling that this was the case. Anyway, but sometimes governments go even further. In Hungary, there was a scandal about school segregation in the town of Gyöngyöspata. In the local elementary school, all Roma students were put on the ground floor, while white students were put on the upper floors. Roma students were banned from going upstairs and they couldn't even use the bathrooms there. They were also banned from after-school study groups and swimming classes and received vastly inferior education.
A gyöngyöspatai iskola története azonban a szegregáció mértéke miatt kirívó. Az iskolában roma és nem roma osztályok is működtek. A roma osztályokat az alsó szinten, a nem roma osztályokat pedig a felső szinten oktatták. A roma gyerekeket pedig fel se engedték erre a szintre, az ottani WC-t nem használhatták, míg a sajátjuk az gyomorforgatóan nézett ki.
Nem lehetett lehúzni, mindenhova volt kenve, de ha felmentünk WC-re, akkor velünk kiabáltak, meg volt, amikor hazazavartak, azért mert fölmentem.
Nem engedték őket be az uszodába, és általában véve sokkal gyengébb színvonalú oktatásban részesültek.
Kijártam a 8-at, és egy ilyen 5-es szinten voltunk. És ezzel nem csak én vagyok így, hanem a többi gyerek is így van, hogy például egybe volt téve az 5-6-7, és a 7-esek is azt tanulták, amit az 5-esek. Akkor hogy bírtunk volna életet elkezdeni rendesen, normálisan. Láttunk őket, hogy mennek úszásórára, láttunk azt, hogy ők megtehetnek mindent, mi meg nem voltunk olyanban részesítve, amiben ők voltak.
De ha be is mentünk volna úszodába, azt mondták volna, hogy menjünk ki, mert fertőzést kapnak.
Ki kap fertőzést?
Hát a magyar gyerekek utánunk, hogy a uszodai vízből.
Délután kellett nekünk járni iskolába, hogy ne találkozzunk a paraszt gyerekekkel. Nem tetszett nekik a pafánk, egy szóval.
Amire értem, hogy félnek a nem romák a romáktól, de miért félnek tőlük?
Ezt már kérdezzék meg tőlük, hogy miért félnek. Akinek nincs félnivalója, az nem fél. Meg egy kisgyerektől, most 2 kisgyereket, most ha egymás mellé teszik, most ő tudja, hogy most ez nem magyar, ez meg cigány, vagy hogy mindegy, fordítva, akkor ők honnan tudják, hogy félni kell egymástól, ha a szülő már nem úgy neveli őket. Már eredetileg úgy vannak nevelve szerintem, hogy nem szabad a cigányokkal együtt lenni. De vannak amúgy normális magyarok is, patán, meg vannak olyanok is, hogy nem normálatlan. Ugyanúgy cigányokban is van jó, meg rossz is.
Because of these measures, Roma children could not be accepted into quality higher education and got stuck at the bottom, flunked out of school later on, and so on. The end result? More poverty and more social problems. Now, to this, proponents of segregation usually respond with the following. You are only against segregating Roma because you haven't gone to school with them. Roma children are very problematic and ruin education for everyone else. But here's why this argument doesn't make any sense. If the problem is problematic children, why not put problematic kids into different classes instead of Roma kids? Take a class of, say, 30 kids, 15 of them Roma, the other 15 aren't. Roma kids generally come from worse socioeconomic backgrounds, so more Roma kids will be problematic. Sure. So we have 10 problematic Roma kids and 3 problematic non-Roma kids. We segregate segregate them based on ethnicity, and would you look at that, both classes ended up with problematic children hindering everyone else's education. Whereas if we organize them based on who's problematic, we get a class of both Roma and non-Roma, but without any problematic kids hindering their education. And the other class of problematic kids shouldn't be just shoved into the lower levels either. They should get the help they need to compensate for their issues. You know, one of the fundamental tasks of the education system. But we never hear the solution from proponents of ethnic segregation. This might come as a shock to everyone, but their problem is not with their kids having to study with problematic kids, it's having to study with Roma kids. It's just fear, prejudice, and disgust at the end of the day. But they're cutting the tree under themselves, you see. Segregated schools just doom another generation of Roma kids to a life without opportunity, proper education, and the ability to make more than the minimum wage, if that, which only results in more crime and social problems. Case in point, according to Roma Versitas, they never had a single Roma student preparing for higher education who came from a segregated school. Back to Gyöngyöspata, Hungary, the families affected in the school segregation case sued the government and won €250,000 as a compensation. But then, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán intervened personally to stop the payout, calling it money for nothing that the victims didn't have to work for, and said that the Soros network is behind the court ruling.
So in 2022, we basically come to a point where almost half of the, young Roma children go to segregated schools. And, segregation is not only outlawed legally, but is also leads to receiving very low quality education in the Hungarian school system, which is anyhow, crumbling as we speak. So in the whole nation, there is protest by teachers and students. And this is usually led by those who go to elite high schools and those who teach in elite high schools in big cities or in the capital in Budapest. But this is multiplied when it comes to Roma students.
The vicious cycle the Roma find themselves in is quite clear. But then, what's the solution? Here, the usual response is that Roma people just need to get their shit together and prove to the rest of society that they can coexist as equals. If a Roma person wants to succeed, surely they can in today's meritocratic world, can't they? Surely they aren't being held back in almost every aspect of life, are they?
So everyday discrimination manifests in, basically all spheres of life. So in housing, in education, which I just talked about, in employment, in healthcare, in whatever sphere of life you can imagine, Roma face racism and discrimination on an everyday basis. I think what is increasing as a form, as a present type of discrimination, is the discrimination in housing. So many people can't imagine that they, turn up for a viewing of a house which they would like to rent, and then they are outright told that, sorry, the apartment has been leased to someone else. This what happens in my experience, and also there is some research around this, 90% of the cases when Roma to-be tenants, turn up for a viewing, or they are already rejected, based on their surnames, based on how they speak in the phone setting up of an interview. Not to talk about the inability financially to rent these apartments. Even if they are able financially, they get to a point where they are able to rent financially, which is not hard, not easy, because there is a lot of discrimination in employment as well. They basically can't rent an apartment. And of course, in every kind of situation, you might face discrimination, and it might be very direct, being told in your face that, sorry, we don't accept Roma people here. But it can be, just like more subtle forms of racism that, oh, sorry, this job vacancy has been filled ever since you applied. And, it's very hard to navigate this system where you don't know, what you're allowed to do and what you can't, basically.
Being Roma is like living life on hardcore difficulty. Most people will dislike or even hate you before you even open your mouth. Baseline services and amenities are suddenly not available to you. Want to move out of the ghetto, get a normal job, and send your kids to a good school? Too bad. Nobody will rent their apartment to you, all the jobs you apply for are suddenly taken, and your kids are automatically barred from the good school. And there are also the everyday things. Like if you want to go have fun, they often won't let you into clubs and bars, security guards in stores will follow you around thinking you're a thief, and so on and so forth. And then we wonder why Roma can't escape their predicament. So, what can we do to help solve this situation?
It's not an easy question to answer because, we are talking about systemic racism and discrimination against Roma in Hungary and all across the world. So you might, consider individual actions, but they might not lead a long way. That's why I believe that, on the long term, we need political leadership that is taking this issue very seriously and implements concrete actions to tackle racism against Roma. So be sure to, vote for those political parties who have an extensive and ambitious political program that supports minorities, including Roma. And these programs should have been, built together with the constituencies, so Roma people in this case. So look out for, this, whether these programs are ambitious enough and they were including Roma, experts and Roma people into their formulation. Hold, your politicians accountable, not just, the present ones, but those who you would like to support to be in power in the longer term. You can also take very effective and impactful and important, direct actions in your daily life. So I would say first educate yourself, investigate how you feel and think about Roma, because, it's most likely that you've never learned, a single history lesson about them. And while you, through education, popular culture, you discovered that, you support Black people, you support other minorities, you support LGBT people. And it's kind of something that, we take for granted, that a lot of, people in society are aware of, Black people's cause, are aware of, migrants' cause. A lot of people are not aware of the Roma cause at all. And of course, if you are in any kind of power holder situation, so if you are a company owner, then have anti-discrimination policy, which is strictly enforced, and work together with Roma organizations so that you can recruit Roma talent as well, and you specifically reach out to them. Be, very direct in formulating that you support members of oppressed communities, minorities to apply for a position, and that you won't discriminate them. And be thorough in your investigation, whether you already have some practices which are exclusive, discriminatory to some. If you're a school principal, be, sure that you imply and apply policies that are inclusive to Roma. So, have a policy that Roma kids who come to your school will be, granted access. Because this is what happens a lot of times, that, only the local, wealthier families can send their children to your school, to a district school. And for some reason, Roma will be rejected. So be very precise in formulating that, all kids are welcome in this school, and be precise in enforcing this policy. And of course, I could go on and on and on in, tailoring this message to different life circumstances and positions, but I hope you got the message.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to becoming aware of the situation with Roma, and on an individual level, making sure to not make the situation any worse for them. Solving the problems affecting Roma is in our common interest as a society, and it's not that difficult actually. When Hungarian-speaking Roma fled the war in Ukraine, Hungarian volunteers actually took the time and effort to create proper, well-resourced educational daycare programs for Roma children. And, surprise surprise, they really appreciated it. And they started improving dramatically. Often for the first time in their lives, they were getting close attention from teachers, and they quality education. They went from little gypsies to just children, learning, playing, enjoying their life. If you want more like this to happen, do look up what kind of local charities there are in your area helping Roma, like Roma Versitas in Hungary, whose donation page is linked in the description. Integration is fully possible in any society not outright hostile against them, and that hostility can be dispelled with time by spreading awareness, by exposing people to positive examples of the ethnic group, and, for the time being, through the work of non-governmental organizations. The Irish were once in the same situation, viewed as inherently inferior, criminal, low IQ, troublemaking degenerates due to their impoverished background. In the US, they were called white N-words, in fact. Racism against the Irish is something unthinkable. And this already happened with Roma in Spain, where, since the Great Gypsy Roundup of the 18th century, Spanish society just sort of chilled out, and now Roma are just another part of them. Between 750,000 and 1.5 million of them seamlessly integrated into Spanish society. And this is the future I want for the rest of Europe as well. Trust me, we will all be better off for it.